San Salvador was a Spanish galleon of 200 tons. When I say tons, that's not a measurement of weight, it's a measurement of volume. A ton was the largest size of barrel they made in those days, and you could stuff 200 of them on a ship of that size, giving a pretty fair idea of how big a ship it was to everybody that could quote that number. Just like saying your refrigerator is 14 cubic feet or so. In any case, she was built at a place called Estapa on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. So San Salvador was not built in Spain, did not cross the Atlantic Ocean, did not sail around Cape Horn. Her entire career of a few short years, 6 or 7, was spent in the Pacific Ocean. She was built in the late 1530s, 1538 or 1539, and even though her official name is the San Salvador, that's how she's known in records and known in history. In her own day, when someone referred to her, most people called her the Juan Rodriguez, because ships in Spanish territory were typically nicknamed after their owners and called after their owners. So the Galleon Juan Rodriguez was owned by a guy named Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. Now that may sound like a familiar name to you. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was born in Spain around the year 1500 and came to the New World as a kid of only 10 or 11 years old as part of the Spanish army. He was a crossbowman. Pretty young to be entering that occupation, but nonetheless, Cabrillo participated in 3 violent conquests. The conquest of Cuba, followed by the conquest of Mexico, which they called New Spain, and then the conquest of Guatemala. By the time he was in his 30s, he had fought his way across most of Mesoamerica and had risen in the colonial social hierarchy to the point where he had landed estates called encomiendas. He had married a well-to-do Spanish lady. He had learned several abilities, acquired abilities he didn't have to begin with. He learned how to build ships, how to navigate them, how to sail them. He learned how to administer things, and of course he had also learned how to read and write. So he was pretty well off. And in a port near his encomienda called Estapa, he built 13 large sailing ships. The second largest ship he built was called the San Salvador, and he built her for himself. Like the others, she was a merchant ship. Even though armed, her primary job was to carry cargo. And indeed, he took the San Salvador on a voyage to Peru and back to Guatemala, where he did pretty well with that. Then, Cabrillo was given the job of leading a new expedition to explore the unknown waters to the north and west of New Spain, leaving from a port called Barra Navidad. So Cabrillo was charged with the task, his expedition was charged with the task of finding a route to Asia. Now it may seem strange someone would sail along the coast of California while trying to get to China, but the Spanish really didn't know much of the geography beyond about central Baja California at that time. What they thought might be the case, and what they hoped might be the case, was that the shore would tend to the west, arcing over all the way across the Pacific to China. If they had done that, then they would have been able to take advantage of the daily and nightly change in winds that happens along those shorelines and find a way to get to China and back again. Now the back again part was the important element here, because prior to this voyage, 4 Spanish expeditions, beginning with Magellan's expedition of 1519 to 1523, ended up sailing across the entire Pacific Ocean from east to west and getting stuck in the Philippines. Try as they might, they couldn't get back across the Pacific against the prevailing trade winds and currents, and that was a problem that wouldn't be solved until about the 1560s. But in those days, they just couldn't get back, and as a result, the survivors of those expeditions had to sail the rest of the way around the world, circumnavigating the Earth, even though they didn't want to, because they couldn't get back across the Pacific. Now, in addition to making that voyage longer, there's another big problem. To get home, they had to sail through forbidden Portuguese waters of the Portuguese hemisphere. As Spaniards, had they been captured by the Portuguese, sailing where they weren't supposed to be, they could have all been executed. So that's not a very promising way to begin, and that's not a good business model. So they needed that way to get back so that they could expend all the wealth, expend the wealth they were extracting from the New World in the form of silver and gold, in purchasing high-end trade goods in Asia and bringing them back. So we know, though, the coastline doesn't actually do that, so the expedition wasn't going to work out that way. They had also hoped that they might find yet another complex, advanced, wealthy civilization to exploit, like the Inca and the Aztec, but they didn't see any of those that met their standards. Finally, they thought there might be a waterway across the top of the Americas linking the Pacific to the Atlantic. If that had been the case, it would have been much easier to get into the Pacific rather than sailing from Europe all the way around the tip of South America, around Cape Horn. That waterway does exist. We call it the Northwest Passage, but Cabrillo never got near it, and it was choked with ice anyway at the time, so it wouldn't have been usable in a way they imagined. So what I'm saying is that there were serious, important strategic objectives of the mission, and they failed to accomplish any of them. So they didn't accomplish any of the things they set out to do. But they didn't know that was going to be the outcome, and they left for Barra Navidad in the summer of 1542 to try and accomplish those things. The expedition consisted of 3 ships. Cabrillo selected his own ship, the San Salvador, a galleon of 200 tons, as the capitana or flagship. There was another ship of 40 tons and a third ship of only 20. About 170 guys on the expedition, and because the San Salvador was the biggest of the 3 ships by far, most of those guys, about 100 or so, would have lived on the San Salvador. Now look around, there's about 40 of you, so imagine 3 times this number of people living on that ship for 2 years, okay? You have gotten to know each other really well by that time, all right? Now, of those people, they constituted an entire whole spectrum of Spanish colonial society. In terms of social standing, going from the esclavos or slaves, goes down to Cabrillo up at the top. Numerous professions, numerous trades represented on the ship. All these guys had to have places to stay. The well-to-do literate ones, the professionals, lived in the Alcazar, or that aftermost area of the ship. As you go through the ship, you'll see some of their bunks populated with the stuff owned by the guy who had that bunk. I think we've got one there for the pilot of the ship to navigate. We have a priest. I believe we have an escribero or notary. And I believe we have the captain of the company of soldiers. We like to present it as though Cabrillo and his friends just went ashore for lunch, leaving all their stuff laying around for you to encounter when you go on board. There's also a table there. Only those people plus Cabrillo could have sat around that table. No one else would have been invited to. So that was about 12 to 18 people, the well-to-do. Everyone else, the vast majority, lived elsewhere on the ship where they could. They didn't have cabins, they didn't have bunks, they didn't have hammocks, they didn't have mattresses, they had pretty much nothing except where they put their bodies down. Either on the open deck in the waist, or in the castillo, kind of in the open, or down in the hold of the ship. Now the hold of our ship is subdivided into watertight compartments. One contains the engine room, one contains the galley, berthing areas, and so forth. The original San Salvador, the hold would have been open from one end to another, awaiting all kinds of stuff going into it. Lowest down would have been the ballast, rocks, and shale, followed by heavy stuff like spare anchors, the guns not mounted on deck, shot to the guns, followed by tier after tier of giant barrels, tons if you will, containing all the stuff they were going to need to eat over the next 2 years. They included such things as barley, oats, dried peas, stockfish or dried fish, salt pork, salt beef, hardtack, hard cheese, wine, olive oil, water, all the stuff they would need to consume. And there was a lot of it because they ate a lot. The average sailor at the time was consuming about 4,500 calories a day. That's about what an athlete on the Tour de France consumes now. While they weren't athletes, they were just trying to stay warm, and they had high metabolisms, and they needed that level of food to sustain it. The examples of the kind of food they ate can be found on the table in the Alcazar and in the Castile. I have to tell you, they aren't really hors d'oeuvres. They're there to demonstrate how unappetizing the menu was. It wasn't a very balanced diet, so it set them up for dietary diseases like scurvy. But that food took up lots and lots of room. They also had other barrels of stuff, linseed oil, tar, spare sails, spare cordage, the big anchor cables also, stuff you needed to operate and maintain the ship over those 2 years. And then what room was left was given over to the animals they had. They had pigs, chickens, and goats for fresh food. They also had about half a dozen big, mean Mastiff dogs, and they had at least 2 horses. The dogs were war dogs. They used them as weapons. The horses were cavalry mounts. And indeed, they had lots of weapons. The sailors were armed. The company of 20 soldiers or so, those guys were armed. The professionals were armed. Cabrillo was armed. Everybody had weapons of some kind or another. And the ship had its own weapons. You see these versos or rail guns. She would have had about a dozen of those. And the big carriage gun on the other side, the bombardetta, 4 to 6 of those. Now, why did they need all those weapons on this ship? Well, they didn't know who they would encounter when they sailed off into the unknown or how hostile that might be. They knew, though, that if they got to Asia, they might face very formidable adversaries against whom they'd have to defend themselves. So if you can imagine, all this stuff, all these weapons, all the instruments to navigate with, all the books and charts and maps, all the people from 5 continents and their stuff, and all the weapons all compacted into this little mass and projected off into the unknown. So it's kind of like Star Trek in that respect, all right? But on the episodes of Star Trek, all the main cast members seem to come back alive. From this expedition, however, of less than a year, it turns out, about half the people that set out came back alive. They died of scurvy or infections or other diseases like typhus, or being lost overboard or being killed in accidents. A few of them were killed in altercations with the natives. The commander, Cabrillo himself, died from injuries he had in an accident getting out of a boat in the Channel Islands, and he's buried in the Channel Islands. So again, that was a pretty sad element of this. So many people died on the expedition. After the ship got back, after not having achieved any objectives, she went on another trading voyage to Peru, where she sank with all hands. So what's left her was somewhere in the bottom of the Pacific. There were depositions and notes taken of the sailors who completed the voyage, but many of those were lost also, along with the log in Cabrillo's journal. So they didn't accomplish any of their objectives. Half the people that set out died. The commander of the expedition died. A lot of the records of the expedition were lost, and the ship itself disappeared without a trace shortly afterwards. So it doesn't sound like a resounding success story when you look at it that way, okay? However, and it wasn't treated that way then either. However, in the years since, we've come to recognize that when those people sailed along this coastline, they were exploring the place that we now live. And the place that we now live, as a result, came to be represented on maps and charts in Europe and in Asia. Not only that, there were people on the ship from Europe and Asia and Africa and North America and South America, and people from those 5 continents came into contact with the indigenous peoples that had lived here for thousands of years without ever realizing those other places ever existed. So that first coming together has come to be sort of an origin story for California, with the result that in California there are no fewer than 1.2 million places with Cabrillo's name on it. Some of you may have driven over the Cabrillo Highway to get here. When you start looking for his name, you see it everywhere. You see images of his ship everywhere. It's become sort of the symbol of our origins. So, because San Diego was the first place the expedition sailed into, and Cabrillo National Monument is in San Diego, my museum decided several years ago to build a replica of Cabrillo's flagship, El Capitan de San Salvador. Didn't have a lot to go on. We knew it was a galleon of 200 tons. That's all. The ships were not built to plans in those days, so we had no plans to draw upon. What we did have, though, is information of other kinds. We had images from artists of that period who were quite detailed and precise in what they painted or drew. We had a number of documents that shipbuilding generates, like invoices and contracts. We also had the results of the excavation of shipwrecks of this period that were excavated and documented by underwater archaeologists. So we combined all that information to conjure the ship you see here. How close of a duplicate to the original issue? That's unknowable because the original disappeared. What we can tell you is that she's as good a representation of the Spanish galleon of 1542 of 200 tons as we can make. She's something Cabrillo would have recognized and known how to sail.